Hello and welcome to Extra Bad Gays, a podcast about all things queer, cultural, political, etc., from the hosts of your hopefully favourite podcast, Bad Gays. My name's Hugh Lemmy.
And I'm Ben Miller. Thanks so much for listening. You may notice that our June episode is a little bit on the late side. In fact, it may be the very beginning of July when you're hearing this. We're so sorry. We had a plan all set up last week. We had even recorded a shorter version of the conversation we're about to have to open into a conversation with our previous guest, Sholem Krishtalka, to talk about a new Andy Warhol exhibit here in Berlin, where both Sholem and I live. And then unfortunately, Sholem was unable to record due to a health issue. He's going to be fine, but we had to make a new plan and re-record the episode. And so here we are a little bit late to have what will hopefully still be an interesting conversation about Pride Month, which is officially June, but as I think all of the LGTV plus community knows, can often also encompass July, right? Pride Month in Berlin is actually July, weirdly. Or I used to work for the gay movement in the US, the gay and lesbian and trans movement, I should say. And the most terrifying thing there was realizing that Pride season actually goes from like January to October. Because there's places in the US where you just cannot have drag queens outside in June or July because they'll melt. I mean, you can't have drag queens on the street in Dallas in August. You'll just be a fucking puddle of foundation, mascara, and a wig floating down the street.
Yeah, we're just starting up our Pride season here in Barcelona. I'm going to a demonstration this afternoon, but the main Pride event, let's say corporate Pride, because that's what we'll be discussing a bit, I think, today. The sort of more mainstream one happens at the end, or sort of halfway through July. They're sort of shared about, I guess. Why does it happen now, Ben?
I'd like to do a reading now from one of my favorite pieces of writing about the very beginning of Pride, and actually one of my very favorite pieces of historical writing ever. It is an excerpt from a book by Martin Duberman called Stonewall, and this is actually the piece of writing that made me want to do this job, because I realized that this is how you could do this. So I'm going to read the opening and then some assorted excerpts from this piece. It's called The Night They Raided Stonewall. Most of the employees at the Stonewall Inn in Greenwich Village, and some of the customers, did drugs, primarily uppers. Desbutal, a mix of desoxin and Nembutal, was a great favorite, although later banned by the FDA, and the bar was also known as a good place to buy acid. The chief supplier was Maggie Jiggs, a famous drag queen who worked the main bar at Stonewall, along with her partner, Tommy Long. Tommy kept a toy duck on the bar that quacked whenever someone left a tip. They were a well-known team with a big following. Maggie, blonde, chubby, and loud, knew everybody's business, and would think nothing if yelling out in the middle of the crowded bar, "Hey girl, I hear you got a whole new plate of false teeth from that fabulous dentist you've been fucking." But Maggie loved people, had good drugs, was always surrounded by gorgeous men, and arranged wonderful three-ways. So her outspokenness, and even her occasional thievery, were usually forgotten. That's the first paragraph, which is, of course, about the Stonewall Inn in Greenwich Village, the raid of which, and the rioting against the raid of which, kicked off the phase of the queer movements that we would call gay liberation. There's already a lot of organizing happening before. There's already a lot of things bubbling up. There's already a change in the character of that organizing, influenced by changes in politics in the 1960s. What the rioting at Stonewall does is it becomes a kind of catalyzing event. I refer to what happens afterwards as the Cambrian explosion of gay liberation. So all of a sudden, all over all of these different cities in the United States and then spreading across the West, you get groups called something like the Gay Liberation Front. There's the Gay Liberation Front in New York, San Francisco, Austin, Texas, Akron, Ohio, Ottumwa, Iowa, right? And they all put out a newspaper and they all put out a magazine, and it's a very different politic than the organizing that's happening before. And what I think is really interesting and important about this event, as we remember it, is that, and it's one of the reasons why I like this piece, starting with Maggie Jiggs and her Desbutal, which, boy, that would be fun to try, and her three-ways and her thievery, seems like a sort of fun camp move. But it's also, I think, actually really politically important. Mm-hmm. Politically effective people are not always as we imagine them, right? Even when we think about good lefty political people, right? Even when we've gotten away from a liberal idea of thinking about the politically effective person as kind of a good citizen who votes, we're still thinking about politically effective people through this very, very narrow lens, I think. And the people who catalyzed Stonewall in this way were not all of them tireless, lifelong organizers. They were really young. They were on drugs. They were not at all the kinds of people, and none of them would have been thought of as in any way important by the society around them. And
Yeah.
yet, they catalyzed this event, which sets off a revolution. And I think
Right.
that's a good reminder to all of us, right? That to be politically effective does not mean one thing, right? There are so many. We have many fewer excuses than we would like to give ourselves, right? There's so much always that we can be doing, and to say that is not in any way to denigrate the importance of them or of what they did, right? To denigrate the importance of Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson and the other kind of heroes and heroines of that day. But it is to say, maybe in a very bad gaze way, that remembering them in their full complexity and remembering the things about them that were not at least societally validated, other than, of course, the kind of subjectivity they inhabited, the sexual or gender subjectivity they inhabited, or their racialization, or their class. But to remember the other things about them that were maybe not so validated is, I think, really important, right? We don't want to think of these people as being sort of chaste heroes or heroines. In fact, there's a great line in the essay that Lenin said that a revolution is a festival of the oppressed, and although Stonewall was not remotely Leninist in any other regard, it was certainly festive.
But this is what's important, I think, about understanding precisely that they weren't necessarily what you'd necessarily think of as lifelong, like, political actors in that conventional way. To understand that actually is what makes sense of why it happened and why it was so important and why things changed afterwards. There is, I guess, today a sort of simplified, almost fairy tale or children's story, a children's book story of what happened at Stonewall as the beginning of something. And it was not the beginning of something, is what you're saying. There was a long history of various gay rights organizing in the United States and internationally. But what happened then was Stonewall was so important in some ways because of what was failing in that organization. And it set this groundwork of establishing a sort of political homosexual identity and a way of working, but that didn't represent the full spectrum of what it meant to be LGBTQ at the time. And the people who were acting at Stonewall, and importantly in the days, weeks, and months afterwards, were people left out of that political organization for whom that sort of, not just political organization, but sexual subjectivity or politicized sexual subjectivity didn't make sense to them. So they're like, we're acting now, it wasn't addressing the problems that they were facing, which in this case was police violence and corruption and a lack of visible representation. Like the path that political organization, that prior political organizing was going down, didn't match the political needs of those people. So those people acted for themselves, which is a very important political message.
It is. Let me read a couple of quotes from descriptions of the rioting so that we know what acting for yourselves looked like. So it's just broken out now, right? From this point on, the melee broke out in several directions and swiftly mounted in intensity. The crowd, now in full cry, started screaming epithets at the police. Pigs, faggot cops. Sylvia and Craig enthusiastically joined in. Sylvia shouting her lungs out, Craig letting go with a full-throated, "Gay power!" One young gay Puerto Rican went fearlessly up to a policeman and yelled in his face, "What have you got against us faggots? We don't do you nothing." Another teenager started kicking at a cop, frequently missing as the cop held him at arm's length. One queen, get ready for this, Hugh, mashed an officer with her heel, knocked him down, grabbed his handcuff keys, freed herself, and passed the keys to another queen behind her.
Excellent. So on the day of Night of Stonewall, so Stonewall, for those who don't know, and I'm sure most people listening to this probably do, was a mafia-run gay bar that was very popular with people who were, I guess, excluded from the sort of more respectable gay bars. So it was a difficult situation because gay bars weren't legal in New York at the time.
They
right?
were all mafia-run.
It was illegal to. But there were places like, for example, Julius's, which had like a different clientele of, let's say, more quote unquote respectable middle class gay men. But then there were places like Stonewall, which was they would kind of let anyone in, and they paid off the cops, so the cops turned a blind eye to it. and that was a bit more sort of like people who today would probably use the term transgender or gender non-conforming. That was much more racially diverse, and those people, that's the only place, one of the only places they could really go to drink. And then the cops turned up and raided the bar, despite having been paid off, and the clientele had reached their limit and fought back. I think what's also important to say is that Stonewall is the start of this new era of a sort of not just gay rights organizing, but also a different attitude towards gay subjectivity in public. But also, this is my old anarchist leanings and trainings coming out. But it wasn't just the eruption of anger at Stonewall that made it significant. It was then the tale of political organizing within communities that came afterwards that made it influential. There had been anti-police riots at sort of gay institutions before in sort of LA and places like this in San Francisco. But what was different here was the sort of groundswell of political organizing taking its influence from anti-imperialist organizing and other movements in the 60s and to change the way that the gay rights movement was looking at the time.
That's a great point. I want to talk about the reaction of the more conservative elements of the movement and the Julius clientele to what happened in a minute. But first, I want to describe the rioting a little bit more, because there's just another image that I think people need to have in their heads. So this is a moment in the rioting when the cops, the original group of cops, have been trapped in the bar by the rioters, and so they've now called in a riot squad of reinforcements to come and get them out. The pattern repeated itself several times. The TPF, this is the riot control unit, would disperse the jeering mob only to have it reform behind them, yelling taunts, tossing bottles and bricks, selling fires at trash cans. When the police whirled around to reverse direction at one point, they found themselves face to face with their worst nightmare. A chorus line of mocking queens, their arms clasped around each other, kicking their heels in the air Rockette style and singing at the tops of their sardonic voices, "We are the Stonewall girls, we wear our hair in curls, we wear no underwear, we show our pubic hair, we wear our dungarees above our Nelly knees." It was a deliciously witty, contemptuous counterpoint to the TPF's brute force, a tactic that transformed a macho eye-for-an-eye combat and provided at least the glimpse of a different and revelatory kind of consciousness.
That's amazing, because it is that glimpse that's starting to emerge. And then what happens after Stonewall is this sort of transition between the old organizations, what they called homophile organizations like the Matakan Society, into something new. So in the aftermath of the riots, there was a meeting called the Eastern Regional Conference of Homophile Organizations that met in November of that year. And previously they had been organizing a thing called the Annual Reminder, which was a sort of very well-disciplined, well-organized homophile, pro-homophile rights demonstration, not even really a march, in which there was a dress code and there were sort of rules around public displays of affection and things like this. And it was very much an appeal to power to say, we're respectable citizens, we conduct ourselves in an orderly manner, and we would like our rights. And at this meeting, Craig Rodwell, who I think you were mentioning before, who was a participant but had been an organizer in these homophile organizations, he sort of raised this idea of a commemoration, an event to commemorate the riots the following year. And this demonstration would be across the nation. It wouldn't have those dress code restrictions. And he was supported in this by the feminist and bisexual activist Brenda Howard, who suggested there could actually be a week of events around this commemoration. And the name of the event was called the Christopher Street Liberation Day, because Christopher Street is the street on which Stonewall Inn was located. And so that really is the birth of what is now Pride celebrations, right? Was the following year like a direct commemoration of what happened at Stonewall, which is why people's referencing back to Stonewall and the fact that Stonewall was a riot and attempt to look at the original politics of those events is still so significant today. So what you see from the very first moments of Pride as a reaction, a response, and a commemoration of what happened at Stonewall was a shift away from this previous, let's say, more conservative, although still very, very influential and quite radical for its time, but still quite conservative mode of organizing, toward which was a demand or a call for tolerance and respect, to something much more in your face. And I think that's really important today when people say, Pride is not just about partying, it's actually a protest. Yes, I think that is a very important point to make. Has always been a protest, but the partying has been an intrinsic part of that protest, because it's a move away from this thing that came before, which was a demand for, or a call for toleration and a pleading for respect, to something else, which was a politics of visibility, where LGBTQ people came out onto the street to find each other. You know, the first slogans, the first poster for an early gay liberation front poster had this sort of photograph of all these young activists, and their faces weren't obscured. They were who they were. They were walking down the street, running down the street, arms locked, very happy, smiling, cheering, and the slogan was "Come out." So you see this move from this old form of politics, which is we will conduct ourselves in an orderly way, and we just want, some private rights, to this other form of politics, which is we're organizing by coming out and saying who we are. And that becomes an extremely effective form of organization, because people see the fact that they're not alone. And that becomes, in some ways, one of the most important parts of Pride, which is that people who are in the closet can then go to Pride or see Pride and be like, oh, look, here's all these people who are not just gay or LGBTQ, but are happy and having fun and enjoying their lives. Maybe I should actually step out of this closet of misery into something different, which is a subtle but very important change from what came before, right?
It is a change. Yeah, I mean, there was the misery for some, but it's also important to remember that if you had enough money, you could live some kind of a life. I don't want to overstate this, right? It's like when people said after Roe versus Wade was overturned, well, rich white women will be fine. Well, some of them won't be, right? And it's still not fine to have to sneak off to another state and risk prosecution to get an abortion, right? It's better than not being able to do that if you need one, but it doesn't mean that you're fine, right? But there were ways that you could live a life that was relatively comfortable, and some people liked that relative comfort and were scared by something that they thought challenged it. So Duberman writes, not all gays were pleased about the eruption at Stonewall. Many wealthier gays, sunning at Fire Island or in the Hamptons for the weekend, either heard about the rioting and ignored it, or caught up with the news belatedly. When they did, they tended to characterize the events at Stonewall as regrettable, as the demented carryings on of stoned, tacky queens, precisely those elements in the gay world from whom they had long since disassociated themselves. Coming back into the city on Sunday night, the beach set might have hastened off to see the nude stage show O Calcutta or the film Midnight Cowboy, titillated by such mainstream daring, while oblivious or scornful of the real-life counterparts being acted out before their averted eyes. There you go.
I think I get that. I think there's also a less cynical reading, which is there were people who were extremely brave in the homophile movement. So I don't know if I would have been brave enough to do a lot of the activism that they were doing, who had invested a lot of time and energy and felt that they were making progress. And they sincerely felt that the acts of rioting were something that would discredit all the political organizing they'd done. And that was, they weren't people who were just sort of off swanning around. They went out the next night and wrote on the boarded up window of the Stonewall, like a sort of plea towards their own community.
We homosexuals plead with our people to please help maintain peaceful and quiet conduct on the streets of the village, Mattashine.
Yeah, which is, that's not the same thing as just being like, oh, these are tacky queens. They're like we feel like this is threatening a lot of the political progress that they felt they were making. Now, in retrospect, we can see that actually that progress was limited compared to the absolute explosion of organizing and the huge cultural shift that's happened in the 50 years since as a result of the gay liberation movement. But I think at the time, it's not a completely selfish sort of acts that they thought they were doing.
Yeah, although, just not to immediately contradict you, but Duberman quotes one of the Mattashine people who he interviewed as saying, and I quote, "The sight of screaming queens forming chorus lines and kicking went against everything that I wanted people to think about homosexuals, that we were a bunch of drag queens in the village acting disorderly and tacky and cheap," end quote.
Okay.
And I think there's also a broader point to be made that is made really well by Jules Gill Peterson in her new book, A Short History of Transmisogyny, which is really great. I highly, highly, highly recommend it to anybody who likes our show, anybody who listens, anybody who liked our book. We also share a publisher. But she talks about trans misogyny as existing before the category of trans woman, right? So we're talking in this moment about a political moment when the category of trans woman as we understand her now, the category of transgender as we understand it now, is still forming. And so these street queens, right, are people who are recognizably trans feminine and of trans experience, and they are part of a historical lineage that evolves both